Hello everyone, welcome to the Washington Times for this special episode of History as It Happens. I'm Martin Di Caro. Today we're going to talk about the Iraq War, 20 years on. On March 20th, 2003, President George W. Bush announced the United States was invading Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. Weapons that did not exist. The war killed thousands of American soldiers and contractors and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people. We were not greeted as liberators. Why? Well, our guest today for this special episode of the podcast is the Dean of U.S. Foreign Policy Historians, Melvyn Leffler. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here to discuss this really important topic with you.
Right. Welcome to the Washington Times, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Virginia and the author of Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush and the Invasion of Iraq. So the book was published to coincide with the anniversary of the war, but you've been working on this book quite a while. You seemed reluctant, as you state in your preface, to take on this project to begin with. Why?
I was reluctant for two reasons. First, I was trying to finish up work that I was doing on the evolution of the Cold War, a topic of which I've written a great deal about. And secondly, and most importantly, I was reluctant to take it on because it was really contemporary history, and the availability of primary source documents would be very limited. I'm a historian who has spent his career in the archives with hundreds and hundreds of archival boxes of documents, and I knew for certain that I would never have access to such documents in writing this type of a book. And so I was very reluctant to undertake it until I met a former member of the Bush administration who talked to me about the possibility of setting up interviews, and I can discuss that further if you like. That's a key to the book.
Absolutely. What is the danger of relying on interviews with and memoirs written by participants who, of course, have an interest in trying to paint this episode in our history in the most positive possible light?
There's tremendous danger of just relying on interviews and memoirs. I was aware of that from the very beginning. I was conscious of the fact that the people I'd be interviewing, if I had the opportunity to interview them, were far better at spinning me than I would be at probing them. I understood that they had spent their careers talking to news media and knowing how to handle difficult, challenging questions. So I made a commitment to myself that if I pursued this book, I would continue my reliance on as many archival documents as I could possibly secure. I knew that I would never have systematic access to the archives, but I also benefited over time by the fact that the National Security Archive, which is an institution committed to securing the declassification of records, the National Security Archive was able to bring about the declassification of hundreds, perhaps some thousands of documents. Of course, nothing like the totality that really exists. I also benefited greatly by the fact that the British Parliament mandated an investigation of the question of why did Tony Blair take Great Britain into the war in Iraq on the side of George W. Bush. So there was a formal parliamentary investigation called the Chilcot Inquiry. And the result of that inquiry were thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of interviews with every single top British official, including hundreds of pages with Tony Blair and Foreign Secretary Jack Straw. But also in the midst of those interviews, every time a government official like Tony Blair would say, I got a memorandum from Jack Straw on such and such a date that said such and such, the inquiry the investigating committee was able to secure the declassification of those documents. And over time, in 2014, 15, 2016, all those documents went up on a website. So there is a lot of information about when Jack Straw talked to, for example, Secretary of State Powell, or Blair's National Security Advisor, David Manning, would talk to Condi Rice, George W. Bush's National Security Advisor. You could find out a lot of information that way.
A history of meetings and conversations and teleconferences, etc. The classification process takes decades. Sometimes documents are never declassified, depending on what we're talking about. Right. You think another 10, 20 years we might have the full documentary record or close to it when it comes to Iraq?
No.
No. Okay.
I don't think so. I myself submitted many mandatory declassification requests in order to get notes of various meetings of the National Security Council principal advisors like Powell and Rumsfeld and Rice and the deputy National Security Advisors. Almost all my MDR, mandatory declassification requests, were either denied in full or redacted, or I still not have gotten the results of them. In the future, I'm sure that the formal transcripts of the National Security Council meetings will be declassified over time, maybe 10, 15 years from now.
You can write a sequel.
but most importantly, in terms of understanding the decision-making process for Iraq, one really needs to get a comprehensive, systematic grasp of the intelligence records. It would be phenomenally useful if researchers could, for example, get the presidential daily briefs that were presented to President Bush every single day.
Those were voluminous each day.
Well, they occur every day. They vary in numbers of pages. During the weeks and months after 9/11, there was presented to the president every day something that was called the threat matrix, which enumerated the scores of threats that had been assessed just the previous day. And George W. Bush was presented with this document with his briefer and with the director of the Central Intelligence, George Tenet, and they would go over all the threats that came in on the previous day and try to assess the salience of these threats. If we could have a sense of what that was day by day, that would help us tremendously in terms of understanding the subsequent decisive actions that were taken or not taken.
Your aim in this book was to explain why things happened the way they did. It was not to write an indictment of George W. Bush and his administration, nor to let him off the hook. And I praise you for that. When I picked up the book, Confronting Saddam Hussein, I wanted to learn two things definitively, to the extent possible. Because let's admit, emotions are still a little raw. 20 years is not a lot of time. Anniversaries have a way of focusing our memories back on unpleasant events, and we're still living with the consequences of this disastrous war today. So I had to clear my mind, approach this with an open mind, and I wanted to learn two things primarily, among other things: when and why. When was the decision to invade Iraq made, and why? For what reasons? And let's start with when, because it has become an article of faith for some people to say the decision was made pretty much right after 9/11. We're going to war in Iraq. You say definitively that was not the case.
That's correct. In fact, a lot of people believe that the decision to invade Iraq and bring about regime change in Iraq was actually made even before 9/11. That is to say that the neocons in the administration, like Paul Wolfowitz, joined the administration with the intent to bring about regime change through an invasion of Iraq. Those notions exist in the literature, and a lot of
regime change was there, but not going to war for it.
Well, that's the issue. I mean, there was a rhetorical commitment, a legislative commitment, to bring about regime change. A resolution passed by Congress under Bill Clinton that the administration itself endorsed to bring about regime change. That was a rhetorical commitment in essence, with some financial support behind it to assist exile groups inside the United States. But what I found in my research, because I systematically looked at this proposition, was that there was no agreement prior to 9/11 whatsoever to really do anything concrete to bring about regime change in Iraq. In fact, policymakers discussed what to do with regard to Saddam Hussein prior to 9/11, and they simply couldn't resolve what to do. The pros and cons of various tactical actions were very complicated, and they could not agree on it. So nothing whatsoever had been resolved prior to 9/11. After 9/11, some policymakers like Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, suggested to President Bush that he turn his attention to Iraq. But I show in my book that initially President Bush rejected those notions.
Yeah, it was just days after 9/11 where this happened. And I believe President Bush did tell them, listen, if you're going to talk to me about an Iraq Al-Qaeda nexus relationship, whatever, you got to find some evidence for it. Wolfowitz then directed Douglas Feith, to set up an office, which was called the Office of Special Plans inside the Pentagon. Not the kindest sounding name, kind of a nefarious sounding name, Office of Special Plans, to look for this evidence. And so there were people early on trying to find something on Saddam, and I think that's why some people today, even at the time, thought that war was decided pretty early here.
No. Yes, I mean, there are many people who focus on the creation of the Office of Special Plans, and that did happen inside the Office of the Secretary of Defense. But the most important thing for you and for readers to know about this is that the CIA and President Bush's briefers told him in the days after 9/11 that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11.
He agreed with them.
And I have found no evidence to suggest that President Bush believed that Saddam Hussein had anything to do with 9/11. However, he was told, and it is a fact, that the Iraqi regime led by Saddam Hussein was gloating over 9/11, expressed satisfaction and gratification that 9/11 had happened. Saddam Hussein's newspapers in Baghdad published articles more or less praising the fact that 9/11 had occurred and that the United States deserved this. No other government, I think, around the globe expressed gratification and pleasure with 9/11. So top policymakers in the United States were immediately informed about Saddam Hussein's praise of the event. And this was one of the factors that drew policymakers' attention to Iraq in the aftermath of 9/11. Of course, there were other very important factors.
Yeah, his history with weapons, right? I mean, he did use chemical weapons in the past, in the war with Iran in the 1980s. He attacked the Kurds in the north of the country.
Well, most importantly, in order to understand why attention gravitated to Iraq, why the president's attention gravitated to Iraq in the weeks and months after 9/11, you need to understand the confluence of several critical events. First of all, one needs to understand that there was enormous apprehension in policymaking circles about the likelihood of a follow-on attack in the United States. There was a widespread belief that another attack was imminent, that another attack of significant dimensions, maybe even greater dimensions, would occur. So that's The evidence of an impending subsequent attack was omnipresent. Second, you need to understand that when American forces moved into Afghanistan, when American special forces moved into Afghanistan, and along with the Northern Alliance, displaced the government, the Taliban government in Kabul, and forced al-Qaeda terrorists to flee from their training camps, evidence was found in those training camps that al-Qaeda was indeed seeking weapons of mass destruction and hoping to develop chemical and biological weapons or to acquire them. There was incontrovertible evidence of that emerges in October, November, December of 2001. At the same time, I'm talking about a confluence of events here. At the same time, one needs to recall that in the United States there was a great fear of anthrax, that envelopes and letters containing anthrax spores circulated in the mail. Several postal workers were killed. These envelopes turned up in the Senate office building. Congressional buildings were closed down. The Supreme Court itself was forced to move its deliberations to another location. In the middle of October, there were sensors inside the White House that went off, suggesting that there was a toxic substance inside the White House. All of this suggested that there was the likelihood or possibility of a biological or chemical attack taking place in the United States. At the same time, we're talking about a confluence of circumstances. At the same time, there were reports, intelligence reports coming in that Saddam Hussein was either restarting or accelerating his biological and chemical weapons programs. We now know in retrospect that much of this information was ill-informed, was coming from suspect informers. But a person who was codenamed Curveball. But at the time, of course, what's important is that at the time this was not known. And so you had information coming in suggesting that Saddam Hussein was involved in restarting or accelerating these programs that we knew he once had and weapons that he had been willing to use against his own people. So it's this confluence of circumstances that led President Bush in late November, early December, to say that we need to prepare war plans for Iraq should it be necessary to take action. One of the things we now know that we really didn't know until recently was how exasperated President Bush was over the fact that when he came into office, there was no war plan to deal with the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And in fact, after 9/11, when he was eager to take action in Afghanistan, he was extraordinarily exasperated by the fact that there were no plans to deal with the situation. The Defense Department and the Central Intelligence Agencies hurried to develop some type of improvised idea to deal with the Taliban, to disrupt the training camps of al-Qaeda. But no such plans existed. What is clear now is that Bush wanted to have plans in place to deal with Iraq should he find it necessary to do so. But it did not mean, one of the things I emphasize in my book, is that it did not mean that he was committed to going to war.
The attention on Iraq intensifies after the Taliban falls in Afghanistan. basically go, now what's next in our war on terror? So they've already declared a war on terror. They're creating a set of circumstances of their own. They're putting the country on war footing. But the final decision is what, January, February of 2003, shortly before the invasion actually begins, is when George Bush says, go, right?
That is pretty much true. Nobody can really tell you when the final decision was made.
This was a process that played out.
It's a long process. One of the problematic aspects of the decision-making process was that there never were meetings that either discussed, one, the pros and cons of invading Iraq to begin with, the fundamental issue of should we invade Iraq? Are the prospective benefits outweighing the prospective liabilities? Such a meeting in which these issues should have been discussed were never systematically discussed, nor was there a formal meeting of any sort in which there was resolution about now we're going to war in Iraq. Such a meeting took place in late February between Bush and his top military people, in which he asked them, are our war plans, this is in late February when a lot of our American combat troops had already been deployed and vessels deployed, and he does...
Which makes it look like war is inevitable.
Right, it makes it look like war is inevitable. And perhaps it was by late February 2003 for a lot of other reasons as well. At that time, President Bush did convene his top military people and say, are we ready? Are you ready? And they say, yes, of course we're ready.
No one questioned the fundamentals as if, whether the United States had a right to preemptively invade another country. Whether they lied about the intelligence or not, your argument is that they did not lie. We'll get to that in a moment. We'll return to some of the public statements that were made. So I think we've tackled when, but the why here is also very important. For what reasons? And you downplay the role of ideology or missionary zeal, I think is the term you use in your book, right. When they were, and you just touched on this a little bit about some of the decision-making process here. The reasons why. You say fear, excessive confidence in American power, and hubris. Not spreading democracy, not ideology, not some other factors.
Well, I discussed the basic motives for going war. Motives are different than goals.
Okay.
The overriding motive for going to war was fear about a prospective attack, again, in the United States, fear about American national security, short-term and long-term. There were two aspects to this fear. There was the short-term aspect, in which President Bush clearly was worried that Saddam's alleged weapons of mass destruction, his chemical or biological weapons, might find their way into the hands of terrorists, perhaps Al-Qaeda terrorists or other terrorists. He was certainly very concerned about that prospect. He was also concerned, as were many of his leading advisors, about the intermediate and long-term problem that if sanctions failed, if the existing regime of sanctions and containment failed, and if Saddam Hussein restarted or accelerated his programs of weapons of mass destruction, which he had been very much committed to in the 1980s and 1990s, if he did these things, in the intermediate term, he would develop weapons of mass destruction, and with those weapons, he would be able to, in the words of American policymakers, blackmail the United States. In other words, the very presence of weapons of mass destruction, chemical or biological, or or after 5 or 10 years, nuclear weapons, the very presence of those weapons would force the United States to self-deter. in a crisis in the Middle East. And American policymakers did not want to face the prospect that they would be paralyzed in the long run by the presence of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of a dictator like Saddam Hussein. So there's this short-term fear of of a prospective attack inside the United States, and an intermediate-term fear that American power will be circumscribed or constrained in the intermediate and long term.
About, I want to just backtrack briefly about the decision, when he made that decision to go ahead with the invasion, and then we'll return to the why issues. That was when inspections were actually taking place. They weren't to the entire satisfaction of the Western world, but there were still inspections going on. What I meant to say is Saddam wasn't entirely cooperating, but nothing was coming up. They weren't finding any actual weapons, and that was used as evidence that he actually was hiding something, rather than give us some pause. Maybe we should wait a little bit longer. So when you say that the president didn't rush to war, he is accused of rushing in those final weeks instead of allowing the full inspection regime to play out, as if, Saddam is about to prove us wrong. He actually doesn't have these weapons. Your response to that?
Well, one can argue that, and that is an argument often made, and one can legitimately say that in February and March of 2003, there was a rush to war. That's different than saying in September of 2001 there was a rush to war.
Timelines are important.
But even in, what's important to know is that in January and February 2003, as the inspectors engaged in their investigations inside Iraq, as you suggested, and they were not finding evidence of the weapons. Nonetheless, the chief of the inspectors, Hans Blix, reported again and again that he did not think that Saddam Hussein had made what Hans Blix considered, quote unquote, a strategic decision to really cooperate and collaborate. It is true, as you are suggesting, and has often been written, that Hans Blix became exasperated with American impatience. That is true.
At the crucial moment.
Hans Blix became very impatient and angry with the United States for eventually going to war in March of 2003. But what is also true and very often stated was that Hans Blix believed that the only way to get Saddam Hussein to cooperate was through the use of military intimidation. Hans Blix was not opposed to the deployment of American forces. He believed that that was absolutely indispensable to get Saddam Hussein to cooperate. Indeed, almost everyone at the time, observers everywhere, assumed that Saddam Hussein would not cooperate, would not allow inspectors back, would not reveal what materials he had, if he had them, would not disclose the materials, unless threatened with the use of force. So Hans Blix said again and again in January and February, he used the term, Saddam Hussein and President Bush are in essence playing a game of chicken with one another. And it's uncertain how long this game can continue. And it's clear that President Bush and his top advisors felt that Saddam Hussein was toying with them, that he was defying them, that despite the fact that things weren't being found, he wasn't cooperating with the UN inspectors, even to their own satisfaction.
And key members of the Bush team, including the president himself, felt they still had to go through this process. I mean, not all of them were on board with process, but they still felt.
No, I mean, that's one of my key themes in my book, of course, is that President Bush is the key decision maker. Not Cheney, not Rumsfeld, not the neocons like Wolfowitz. And President Bush did want this process to go on. President Bush was committed to these notions of coercive diplomacy.
I want to ask you about coercive diplomacy and what that is, because that's the tact they chose to take after the initial days that we've been discussing here, when they decided to focus on Iraq. And we've been discussing for what reasons. It wasn't missionary zeal, it wasn't ideology, it was realism and fear of another attack. Right?
I should say, by the way, as we discuss this, since often the discussions about what happened after 9/11 focus exclusively on Iraq, one should keep in mind that policymakers in the administration were not just interested in Iraq. Policymakers were interested in the existence of terrorists in many places around the globe. They were very focused on Indonesia. They were focused on the Philippines. They were preoccupied, extremely preoccupied, that Pakistani weapons not find their way into the hands of terrorists. So one should keep in mind that Iraq was not the exclusive focus of policymakers. They were focused, the global war on terror was happening in many, many places. Now, they did decide in January and February of 2002 to embark upon this course of coercive diplomacy with regard to Iraq.
That's true.
And the idea...
To me, coercive diplomacy made war more likely, not less. Although that could be my memory, looking back on things with the benefit of hindsight.
One can readily say that. I agree with that. Coercive diplomacy did make war more likely if Saddam Hussein did not cooperate. And one of the themes of my book, and what's important to realize in this whole story, is that Saddam Hussein is an important part of the story. There is contingency here. I purposefully start my book with a chapter of Saddam Hussein because it is important for readers and observers to understand who this man was, what he had done, in order to really grasp the fears and apprehensions of American policymakers. So
they didn't expect him to cooperate, though. That's one of the contradictions here.
Well,
they wanted him to go along with what they were demanding of another sovereign country.
Well, they were uncertain if he would cooperate. No one believed he would cooperate unless threatened with military force. That was a given. So then there was the issue of, if threatened with military force, will he cooperate? And this is an important part of my book, and one that is not usually discussed elsewhere because it depends a lot. My information came from British records. Tony Blair spoke to President Bush about the fact, if we go to the UN, if we engage in the diplomacy at the UN, and if we get another resolution, and if it is backed by force, and then if Saddam Hussein actually agrees, Tony Blair said to President Bush, we need to take yes for an answer. Tony Blair did not expect yes, nor, that Hussein would say yes, nor did President Bush expect Saddam Hussein to say yes. But they acknowledged to one another, and their national security advisors talked to one another about this, that if Saddam Hussein actually did say yes, if he did cooperate with a new resolution, if he did disclose and or relinquish his alleged weapons of mass destruction, then we would have to live with this regime. But we would never get to know this unless he was threatened with force. Whether he would agree or not was up to Saddam Hussein. And so he could have agreed. He could have been more forthcoming at an earlier moment. Hans Blix wanted him to be more forthcoming.
But ultimately, he couldn't give up what he didn't have.
Ultimately, he couldn't give up what he couldn't have, but he could have been much more forthcoming in terms of
he wanted to bluff, didn't he, somewhat?
Well, yes. I mean, and that's one of the interesting aspects of this whole episode is that Saddam Hussein ultimately did not have, at this moment in time, the weapons of mass destruction. But almost everyone believed that he did, including most of his own military officials and most of his own advisors believed that he had weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
He had such a record of deception and concealing that nobody really knew for sure, even his own advisors, whether he had weapons of mass destruction or did not have weapons of mass destruction.
They were stunned late in the game when he told them to start cooperating with the inspectors.
Right, and very careful studies, far more careful than mine, who have looked into this, illuminate the fact that when he tells his top military people and his top scientific people to cooperate, they don't know if they actually should cooperate, if he really means that they should cooperate or not to cooperate. And if they do cooperate, they sort of think, well, others aren't cooperating because the others know they should not cooperate. So it's part of this impact that Saddam Hussein has not only on adversaries abroad, but on the people who work for him. I mean, one has to understand or
he wasn't
try
a
to
good
understand.
employer. No, he was not a good employer. They were afraid of him, of course.
Of course they were. They had good reason to be intimidated by him.
You paint a more sympathetic portrait of George W. Bush than have his harshest critics. You say he wasn't a warmonger, he wasn't stupid, he wasn't lazy, not a puppet of his advisors. He was the decider. He was engaged. He asked a lot of questions, although he didn't probe too deeply on some things. Yet I still came away from reading your work, Confronting Saddam Hussein, convinced that Bush was almost totally ignorant of the history and culture of the Middle East, and also intellectually lazy about the world. He didn't understand why there was so much anti-Americanism in the region. He subscribed to a simple worldview, a dichotomous worldview. You're with us or against us, one of the turns of phrase that lives on from that era. A freedom or dictatorship, good versus evil type of worldview. You know, no one wants to live in no one wants to live in a dictatorship. So naturally, why wouldn't Iraqis be willing to live under freedom, Western style freedom? He also didn't understand the motivations, and you make this clear in your book. He didn't understand the motivations of the terrorists themselves. He didn't really know a lot about Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. What can you say about Bush's mindset and how that contributed to this disastrous mistake?
Well, there are many things that could be said about George W. Bush in this respect, and the themes of my book relate to fear, as you said earlier, power,
and hubris.
And hubris. And it's incredibly important to understand the interaction of these three factors. So many of the qualities you just enumerated fall under the subject matter of hubris in my book. Yes, George W. Bush believed that, you know, all people wanted to be free, all people wanted to have democratic institutions. He did believe that American soldiers would be welcomed with chocolates and flowers, as Iraqi exile leaders in the United States told him.
Some of whom were con men. Ahmed Chalabi was a...
Pardon me?
Ahmed Chalabi was a con man.
Right. I mean, well, I would...
Maybe you want to call him that.
Those are your words, and you're entitled to them.
Yeah.
Actually, George W. Bush did not want Chalabi to take over Iraq. One of the interesting aspects is that he was actually opposed to that, but that's a sideshow.
Didn't mean to digress.
That's a sideshow.
Yeah.
But you are absolutely right, and I tried to make clear in my book that there was a great deal of hubris that contributed to this venture, to the decision to invade Iraq. Most importantly, what you did not mention was the notion or the memory firmly emplaced in the mindset of all these advisors, especially people like Condi Rice and Dick Cheney, who had participated in the end game of the Cold War. What all these policymakers had in their minds, vividly in their minds, was that the Cold War ended with the Berlin Wall toppled, with East Germans enthusiastically parading in the streets, with East Europeans, with Poles and Hungarians embracing the possibility of freedom and democracy. And their notion was, the notion of American policymakers was, we had waged the Cold War for 40 years successfully, and the return on that was jubilation in that part of the world that had to live behind the Iron Curtain.
So millions of people took to the streets.
And so the policymakers, President Bush, Dick Cheney, Condi Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, I think they all did firmly believe that the United States soldiers would be welcome, that Iraqis would embrace them. And I emphasize in the book that they did not understand, they did not grasp the degree to which Iraqis were extremely suspicious of American intentions. They did not really understand the degree to which the Kurds in the north of Iraq had deep reasons to suspect the credibility of the United States, because the United States had betrayed the Kurds many times in the past. They did not understand the degree to which the Shia in the southern parts of Iraq were totally suspicious of the United States, because Bush's own father, when president in 1990 and 91, had more or less encouraged the Shia to rise up, and then did nothing when Saddam Hussein exterminated them.
And then the sanctions as well.
And so there was a great deal of reason to understand why Iraqis would not necessarily be enthusiastic about an American invasion. But at the same time, one should understand, and one should keep in mind, Iraqis did want to get rid of Saddam Hussein. It wasn't that they, were opposed to the removal of Saddam Hussein.
That's right. And the sanctions as well, which were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis based on some estimates, including many, many children. Iraqis were aware that Madeleine Albright went on television, was asked about these sanctions. Is it worth the price? All these children who are dying as a result. And she said, yes. March 16th, 2003, Dick Cheney is on Meet the Press with Tim Russert. The read we get on the people of Iraq is there's no question but that they want to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Well, that was true. And they will welcome us as liberators. He said that we'll be welcomed as liberators several times in that interview. One of the immortal, or I should say, that'll live on forever.
Well,
that quote.
One should not immediately think that the disorder and anarchy inside Iraq reflected anti-Americanism. What happened inside Iraq in March and April and May and June of 2003, the events that I cover very carefully, were reflections of the inability of the United States to really establish order inside Iraq.
No.
And the initial disorder inside Iraq was not anti-Americanism.
The looting wasn't an insurgency.
Yeah, there was the insurgency that we all have in our minds grew incrementally over time.
Catalyzed by the fact, I'm sorry to interrupt, Melvyn, but catalyzed by the fact that the United States, our troops were killing so many Iraqis.
Well,
that drove a lot of people into the arms of the insurgency.
Well, of course, American actions and repression worsened the
Yes.
situation. But there was also immediately the real compelling factor inside Iraq in March, I should say in April and May and June of 2003, was the disorder and strife and looting amongst Iraqis. And one of the major preoccupations of Iraqis, one of the reasons for their disillusionment, which they state again and again with the United States, was the failure of the United States Army to preserve order and stability. The antipathy to the United States mounts because of the very inability of Americans to preserve the order
That's right.
that
all the way down
Iraqis
to
wanted. And then in addition to that, as I explain in my book, the United States partakes in several critical decisions with regard to the disbandment of the Iraqi army and the de-Baathification of the top ranks of the Iraqi civilian agencies. Those decisions, which are difficult decisions, wind up alienating different sectors and different segments of the Iraqi population, and incrementally disaffected Iraqis who are affected by these very decisions move and gravitate into an insurrectionary movement. But that happens in a dynamic way over time.
It takes on a life of its own, and Shia and Sunni turn on each other, Sunnis turning on Sunnis. It was a debacle. One word about the lack of order, I was going to say, all the way down to something as simple as trash removal. I mean, nothing was functioning in Iraq. There wasn't running water, there wasn't electricity.
Well, one of the most important things was almost all the ministries were immediately looted and burned.
Stripped of everything.
Exactly, everything.
So back to coercive diplomacy briefly. We touched on it before. It's a key point of your book. This seemed to fit Bush's personality. Briefly, this is diplomacy backed up by the threat of force.
Correct.
And intensifying those threats, right? Ratcheting up the pressure as the time goes by if you're not complying with U.S. demands. So, as John Dower wrote in his great book, Cultures of War, I still think of these two sentences from a book I read, 10, 15 years ago. Most wars easy to initiate prove difficult and costly to end. Language and rhetoric themselves become a prison, and the machinery of destruction has its own momentum. In a sense, the Bush administration trapped itself. When I read the comments, the interviews, the speeches, the news conferences off the page, the words off the page, I do get the impression that they were trying to be cautious. They weren't rushing to war. They wanted to give diplomacy a shot. But when I've gone back and now watched some of these speeches and rallies and interviews, such as on Meet the Press, it hits you differently. It's more bellicose. It's more threatening. And as Dower said, language and rhetoric themselves become a prison. You've declared a global war, right? You've called it an axis of evil, right?
Of course, yes, the words become more threatening, and they were intended to become more threatening because coercive diplomacy was designed to intimidate Saddam Hussein and to force him either to disclose or relinquish his weapons of mass destruction, or to flee, or to encourage an assassination against him. So yes, those words were designed to intimidate. That's what coercive diplomacy was about. But then again, Saddam Hussein had agency of his own. He could have acted differently during this process, and he chose not to. But you are absolutely right at the same time, and this is why it's complicated. There are different issues here. But you are absolutely right in saying that these actions, the pursuit of coercive diplomacy, given the fact that Saddam Hussein did what he did, entraps the United States. And the policymakers themselves state as I explain
Yeah.
toward the end of the book, they themselves state our credibility is now vested in getting rid of Saddam Hussein. He's toying with us. And we cannot allow this, because if we do, our allies in the region, our perceived friends in the region, like the Saudis, will lose confidence in us. Once again, they will think that we didn't have the will to carry out the invasion of Iraq and the destruction of Saddam Hussein's regime.
And we had our troops stationed in Kuwait too, and the weather was about to turn
Right.
broiling
Well,
hot
those are factors that.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I want to make clear to our viewers, our listeners, at no point in your book do you say this justified an invasion. What you're trying to do is explain why things happened and what our leaders believed at the time.
Yeah.
So on that point about whether this was lying, you might remember there were some bumper stickers from those days. Bush lied, people died. Rather simplistic way of looking at things. This is where I feel dishonesty did play a role. Dick Cheney, at some point in 2002, I don't have the precise date, but it was before the invasion, said, simply stated, this was in an interview, or I think in a speech, Dick Cheney, simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us. That sentence or two sentences would have been fine if he said it's possible, but he said there is no doubt, and the administration knew there were doubts. Let's return to Curveball. He was an Iraqi exile living in Germany who later admitted that he basically made up everything about Saddam's chemical weapons. He was a fantasist. He was able to get German intelligence to interview him somehow. I don't know the whole story. His name was Rafid al-Janabi. But at the time, there were questions about Curveball's veracity.
The questions about Curveball.
And his presentation, his claims wound up in Colin Powell's presentation.
Yeah, but the doubts about Curveball, it's extremely important to keep in mind.
Yeah.
The doubts about him emerge incrementally.
Okay.
And the credibility of his information is not widely questioned until long into this process of late 2002, early 2003. So it's inappropriate to say that, oh, people knew that Curveball was misinforming them. Yes, there were doubts. One of the important things I argue in my book, and you're perfectly right in stating that policymakers were not certain that the information compellingly demonstrated that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But these policymakers were all experienced people. They knew that, quote, intelligence never is dispositive. There's always questions about the veracity and credibility of intelligence. But what they did know, and what they said again and again, we know that Saddam Hussein developed weapons of mass destruction, that he had used weapons of mass destruction against Iran and against his own people, that he had lied about the weapons of mass destruction, and that he had concealed them. They knew those things as facts.
And that he probably wanted them again.
And they were convinced that he wanted them again, exactly as you said. Yeah. So yes, they're uncertain about the credibility and the reliability of the intelligence they are getting, in which people are arguing about, as I illuminate in my book. But what they know in their minds, which was wrong, what they know in their minds is that this guy once had it, used it, and is capable of doing things of that sort again. So one of the themes of my book, or one of the extrapolations that's really important, is that policymakers need to re-examine fundamental assumptions. The fundamental assumption here was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. I demonstrate in the book that top policymakers all believe that. As Richard Haas, the head of the policy planning staff, who was sort of against the war, he stated in his own memoir, "I never met an intelligence analyst during my years in government who told me Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction."
European governments did, Arab
So
governments.
policymakers need to re-examine fundamental assumptions. That's easy to say, correct?
Yeah.
That's easy to say. How often do you re-examine your fundamental assumptions? How often do I examine my fundamental assumptions? We don't, because we sort of think our fundamental assumptions are fundamental and therefore we don't need to re-examine them.
And you have a responsibility to protect the country in a climate after 9/11.
So it's easy to say that. It's easy to say re-examine fundamental assumptions, but it's really hard to do. And yet that's one of the takeaways of my book. Policymakers need to re-examine fundamental assumptions because their fundamental assumption in this case was wrong.
Basing a war, there's no greater responsibility or larger decision any government can make than sending our citizens off to fight a war. One more point about intelligence, and then we'll wrap up with some more general thoughts about American foreign policy, which you have been writing about for many decades. I introduced you as the dean of U.S. foreign policy. I read Spectre of Communism in college. I was assigned that book in the mid-1990s. So, and it's still relevant, and it still sells. The Saddam al-Qaeda connection. Dick Cheney said in multiple television interviews that Mohammed Atta, who was one of the hijackers, met an Iraqi intelligence agent in Prague. He said that this was confirmed with an interview with Tim Russert. It wasn't confirmed. A month later, the FBI ascertained that Atta was in Florida at the time. Cheney went back on TV later the year and repeated this again. You've said that Cheney was not the decider here, but he was still an influential voice. He gave a speech to the veterans of foreign wars, a major speech that he basically freelanced. He wasn't supposed to give that speech, where he essentially declares war on Saddam Hussein, even though he doesn't have the power to do that.
Yeah. Well, actually, President Bush indirectly reprimands Dick Cheney for giving that speech, and one should not assume, as I show in my book, that Dick Cheney is a key decision maker. And this relationship between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein is a relationship that is constantly being examined by the intelligence agencies and by top policymakers. And they often come to the conclusion that there is no collaborative relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. But they also suggest that there's possibilities that Saddam Hussein's regime, his intelligence service, might be involved in various types of training exercises or providing weapons. There's ambiguity and uncertainty. That is the ambiguity and uncertainty that inheres in policymaking. Yeah. They knew that there was, quote, no collaborative relationship, and I show that President Bush, when he's presented with this evidence, says, good try, he says to Scooter Libby, when Scooter Libby, Cheney's top assistant, is making this argument that al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein are linked to one another in August of 2002, and President Bush says, good try, keep digging. Yeah. But he himself, President Bush, is not convinced. But he is worried, very worried, about the possibility that Saddam Hussein may have chemical and biological weapons, and that those weapons might find their way into the hands of terrorists. Perhaps al-Qaeda terrorists, perhaps other terrorists.
There were some al-Qaeda dudes operating in a part of northeastern Iraq. That was outside the control. It was in the no-fly zone of Saddam Hussein. But that ambiguity was never expressed, looking back on it now, to my satisfaction, the American people's satisfaction.
No, because...
Here, one more quote from Cheney, the Cheney Hall of Fame here, if you will. Another interview with Tim Russert a few days before the invasion. We know Saddam's trying once again to produce nuclear weapons. We know he has a long-standing relationship with various terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda organization. We know he has a long-standing relationship with Al-Qaeda. That wasn't true. And
Well,
I think Cheney knew it, but I can't prove that.
well, policymakers here, if you're talking 2 days before the war,
Yeah.
they're mobilizing
Yeah.
American opinion for the war. It doesn't explain, those quotations don't explain why the decisions were made.
We're just a few days out.
There's a difference between what is influencing policymakers and what they are saying to the public in order to mobilize support behind a particular policy, as is always the case.
How has U.S. foreign policy changed since 2003 as a result of this?
Are you talking about compared to today? Well,
Yeah, just over the last 20 years, do you see any major changes in U.S.
well,
foreign policy?
of course, the quagmire and debacle in Iraq had huge impact over the subsequent years in terms of President Obama's willingness to get involved in various types of insurgencies. It led to a great deal of caution in terms of what to do in Syria, in Libya. It affected what the United States would do in Afghanistan, and certainly what it did subsequently in Iraq. So the debacle and the quagmire in Iraq, the insurrectionary activity, had a huge impact on America's willingness to use its power in subsequent situation, which many people would say was a good lesson. I mean, a good lesson of the war was to grasp the limits of your power. And that is an important lesson. The United States didn't have the power to build democracy in Iraq or in Syria, although there are elements of democratic institutions, important ones in Iraq today, partly as a result of what the United States did. That doesn't justify what happened. But
Well, they may have gotten there on their own at some
grasping
point.
the limits of your power is an important lesson. But it's easy to say that. What does it mean to grasp the limits of your power? It's important to know you can't do everything you want to do, but it doesn't really explain when you should use your power.
When you listen to President Biden's remarks about Ukraine, it doesn't sound like the establishment, the foreign policy establishment, both major parties, question the fundamentals about American hegemony.
Well, I think when you listen to President Obama, President Biden listening, talking about the present situation in Ukraine, I would suggest to you that he's learned a lot from this situation. One of the important takeaways from my book is the importance of policymakers defining priorities. And in this case, in Iraq, President Bush never really clarified priorities. I would say that one of the lessons that President Biden has learned is that in this situation in Ukraine, an overriding priority is to avoid a nuclear war with Russia.
Yeah.
And so the steps you want to take are going to be limited, but influential, hopefully, in helping the Ukrainians without provoking a major conflict with Russia.
Your point about Bush in 2003, yet they never resolved the contradictions in his priorities. Do we want regime change? Do we want disarmament? Can we bring about regime change without going to war? There was some inconsistency there, which I think led to the expectation among many people that this was just all about a pretext for war. Your book does challenge that notion. To what extent was the global war on terror, if I can call it in the past tense, to what extent is the global war on terror a continuation of U.S. foreign policy post-1945?
Well, first of all, I mean, let me link that to the question you just asked.
Yeah.
One of the important things to realize is that during this period, late 90s and after 9/11, the focus of American foreign policy was on non-state actors, on terrorists, on counterterrorism. That for roughly a decade or 15 years became the major preoccupation. Why was that the case? That was the case because the United States had in effect achieved hegemony after the end of the Cold War. There was no great power competition. So the preoccupation, for good reasons, legitimate reasons, was with terrorism and counterterrorism and non-state actors. What's changed in the world mightily over the last 10 or 15 years is that we have a resurgence of traditional geopolitics. We have the resurgence of geopolitical rivalries among great powers. One of the consequences of this preoccupation with Iraq and with counterterrorism is that it did divert attention from the rise of China and from the revanchism of Russia during these years. But geopolitics today is hugely different than geopolitics during this era.
But there still are continuities. I mean, in the specter of communism, you write about. It's been a while since I read the book, but
you should read it again.
Yeah,
Everybody should read it.
You wrote about how the U.S. knew it had a major advantage over the USSR in many areas post-1945, but we still, I don't want to say inflated the threat. Well, I will say inflated the threat. You can watch Harry Truman or listen to Harry Truman's 1947 speech about communist domination of the world. This is the speech where the Truman Doctrine is enunciated, and he talks about needing aid for Greece and Turkey. You could also read Truman's speech as an admission that he knew that socialism was going to be something that people in the so-called developing or third world, it would appeal to people in the third world, and that the U.S. had something to do about it. So inflating the threat of communism, looking back on it again with the benefit of hindsight, but even at the time there were people post 9/11 who said we're inflating the threat to our country of Islamic terrorism, and that preemptive invasions is not the right way to go about doing this. That wasn't so much a question as a word salad, but take that on if you don't mind.
Well, there was tremendous fear
Yeah.
of another attack after 9/11, and in my view, it was a well-founded fear of another terrorist attack. Whether that fear needed to gravitate into a war against Iraq is a different question.
Yeah.
And I think in retrospect, if you assess the prospective benefits against the prospective costs or liabilities, you would decide not to go to war in Iraq. But the fact that people were preoccupied with fear was a legitimate apprehension at the time. Now, in terms of the continuities of American foreign policy, one of the things I wrote long before I wrote this book, was that in fact Bush's national security strategy reflected basic continuities in American foreign policy. The idea of establishing military supremacy was not a new idea. I mean, ever since the beginnings of the Cold War, the United States sought to have military supremacy, except for a very brief time when it was pursuing détente. But basically, the desire of military superiority was not new was not a new idea in the history of American foreign policy, especially since World War II. Nor was the idea, for example, of having an open international order based on free markets and the movement of capital. These were, in many ways, traditional American foreign policies. Even the idea of preemption, I've argued that people say, oh, this was something really, really new for George W. Bush. But preemption was not a new policy for the United States foreign policy. I mean, when you think about it, when President John Kennedy imposed a blockade on Cuba and was, during the
was an
Cuban
act of
Missile
war, yeah.
Crisis, that's an act of war. The United States was taking preemptive action at that period of time. So, and President Clinton sort of announced in the 1990s that he would be willing to take preemptive action against terrorists. So there is a lot of continuity here in the history of American foreign policy.
One last point I'll make, and we'll wrap up. And I'll add that I may be the only interviewer in Washington who reads to his guests, but the listeners of my podcast, History as It Happens, know that I often pick up books written by historians and I share some ideas. As not a historian myself, so I must cite the work of others. John W. Dower, in his book, The Violent American Century, writes, when the administration of George Bush responded to September 11 by declaring a global war on terror and launching the disastrous invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, it was not really deviating from the thrust of existing policy, as so many have argued. The excessive response to the atrocity carried out by al-Qaeda's 19 terrorists, inaugurated in the case of the 2003 invasion of Iraq by massive bombardment intended to shock and awe the foe, essentially, writes Dower, involved unleashing a war-fighting machine already primed and experienced in overseas interventions, including intensive bombing, covert operations, and practices on the dark side, referring to torture. So let's play Stump the Historian, and I'll tell you why I'm reading this quote after I do so. See if you can say which president said this. It's easy to say that we really have no interests in who lives in this or that valley in Bosnia, or who owns a strip of brushland in the Horn of Africa, or some piece of parched earth by the Jordan River. But the true measure of our interest lies not in how small or distant these places are, or in whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread? We should not be involved everywhere, but where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so.
I don't know who said that. I could imagine George H.W. Bush
Could be any American president,
saying something like that.
That was Clinton in 1999.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
At the end of a decade that has often been criticized as a decade of American foreign policy drift, this was Clinton trying to explain, where the United States should get involved in the world now that the Soviet Union is gone.
I should tell you, George H.W. Bush, at the end of his administration, gave a couple of speeches in which he said almost precisely the same thing.
Because the Soviet Union is gone, right?
What that quotation suggests is something that I firmly believe, and that's there is turmoil everywhere in the world, and there always will be. But it's vital for American decision makers and for the American people to assess and determine what constitutes a so-called existential threat. What really is an existential threat? It's also extremely important, as this quotation suggests, and which I embrace, for American policymakers and the American people to carefully assess what constitutes a vital interest. Where are our vital interests? Do we have, like today, do we have a vital interest in Taiwan? Yes or no? I believe very thoughtful people can argue that in both ways. But it has no easy answer. But it is imperative, as Clinton's quotation suggests, to think hard and long. What constitutes a vital interest? What constitutes an existential threat? Once you decide if something is a vital interest or is not, then you can begin to grapple with what are the appropriate tactics.
I don't think we've done that effectively, though, and that's kind of why I brought up the Clinton quote. I thought the early 90s, looking back on it now, was an opportunity to really reassess what the U.S. role should be, what the role of U.S. power should be in the world with the Soviet Union now gone. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we did. We basically hit the gas pedal, trumpeted the triumph, and went full speed ahead. Clinton was trying to explain why we would get involved in tiny little places all over the world.
The issue is, what constitutes a reassessment, and
That's a tough one.
what is it that is desirable to achieve? So many people living in the 1990s, like President Clinton himself, believed that this was a decade in which democracy was spreading around the globe, and it was spreading. That this was a decade in which prosperity was growing around the
Capitalism.
globe, and it was happening. That this was a decade in which impoverished people in many critical countries like China and India were climbing out of fundamental impoverishment. So there were many reasons to think in the 1990s that the world that the United States was trying to nurture was indeed a world that not only benefited the United States, but was also benefiting other countries. And I think one has to understand that context. And President Clinton actually believed, as did George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, that the problem after the Cold War was that American people were losing interest in the world, that there was a growing isolationism, that there was not enough concern with the idea of continuing the effort to promote democracy and prosperity. Now, whether that required the United States to build up its military infrastructure as it did, and whether it required the United States to get involved in controversies in different parts of the world, these were difficult questions to decide. What constitutes a transformative moment is the fact that you have 9/11. And 9/11 represents a transformative event in the sense of making Americans, not only policymakers, but most Americans feel extraordinarily vulnerable. And because Americans feel extraordinarily vulnerable, they are inclined to support initiatives that they might otherwise not support.
Because we haven't been doing enough. We haven't been paying attention,
Right.
and look what happened.
And the important thing is always to decide, well, what constitutes a vital interest that we now need to do? What is a real threat? To what extent do the threats that now exist after 9/11 justify A, B, C, or D? The threats that existed after 9/11 were real threats. Doesn't mean that the United States needed, one, to have a global war on terror. It doesn't necessarily mean that the United States should have invaded Iraq, but the facts, but the fears were real. And what I tried to do in my book is both to illuminate why policymakers felt fearful, and then to examine whether they took appropriate actions in relationship to the fears that existed. And so my book is both very empathetic, but also, as you know, extremely critical. But it raises the basic question of, when there is fear, when there is threat perception, what sorts of actions are appropriate, and how to calibrate them in ways that maximize benefits and minimize costs. And I'm very critical of the Bush administration for not systematically examining costs and consequences of a prospective invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, really remarkable how little thought went into that part of it. As you say in your book, we must get this story right if we're going to avoid these mistakes again. The book is Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush, and the Invasion of Iraq. Melvyn Leffler, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, I think I plumbed the depths of your mind adequately here, and you're always welcome back on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
And thank you to everyone who's been listening. This is Martin Di Caro at History as It Happens.